So what are we even talking about here? There are lots and lots of different human traits, and the big question is, are these traits genetic, or are these traits more environmental, or are they something in between? What kinds of traits? Albinism, albino skin coloration, polydactyly, having 6 fingers or toes. Is obesity genetic? Is obesity environmental? Is it some combination? How do we even figure that out? What about cancer? What about certain, the predisposition for various kinds of cancer, or even whether or not you like chocolate? The big question is, how do we figure out what's genetic and what's not? So one of the things that we need to recognize is that this is not necessarily an easy job the way it might have been for Gregor Mendel. Mendel was able to take his pea plants and control which pea plant bred with which other pea plant, but that's actually not possible in human beings. It's not ethical. So we need to figure out some other mechanisms for figuring out whether or not something is genetic or environmental. Pedigrees is one way. We've already talked about it in another video, and you can click on my other video to learn a little bit more about pedigrees. So this particular video is going to focus especially on 2 other mechanisms for figuring out whether something's genetic, and those are called epidemiology and twin studies. So let's start talking about epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of the incidence and distribution of diseases in populations. So rather than looking at a particular individual or a particular family and what genes they might have, we're going to look at entire groups of people that have something in common. Maybe it's geography, maybe it's environment, maybe it is their common gene pool. This is what we're going to examine in epidemiology. Now, there are many different studies of epidemiology out there. We're going to focus on one that I think is really seminal. It was an article published by Buell and Dunn in 1965 that focused on cancer rates among Japanese immigrants to California in the early part of the 20th century. So what Buell and Dunn had a chance to do was take a look at some data from a really interesting historical source. Between the 1870s and 1920s, about 40,000 Japanese immigrants moved from Japan into the United States, particularly into California. There's a complicated history there. It was really ugly on the California side. It was actually pretty ugly on the Japanese side as well. But as these Japanese migrants moved into California, meticulous medical records were kept of their health. And Buell and Dunn examined that data and made some interesting observations. The first interesting observation was that Japanese people living in Japan had a rate of stomach cancer that was more than 6 times the rate for Caucasian people who had been living in California their entire lives. In contrast to that, Caucasian people living in California had a prostate cancer rate that was 10 times the rate of Japanese people living in Japan. So how can Buell and Dunn think about these interesting differences in the rates of cancer between Japanese immigrants to California and Caucasians who lived in California their entire lives? It seems very reasonable that each of these cancers might exist on a spectrum, somewhere between being 100% genetic or 100% environmental. By 100% genetic, what we mean is that perhaps there's something about Japanese ancestry, Japanese genes that are carried by Japanese populations that make them either more likely or less likely to carry a particular predisposition for cancer, or likewise, Caucasians could be carrying certain genes that predispose them to cancer. The other possibility is that it's 100% environmental, that there's something about California or something about Japan, about the food, about the water, about the pollution that causes particular types of cancer to be more common or less common in a given spot. Well, how are we going to parse out this idea of whether or not a given condition is genetic or environmental? Let's take a look at what Buell and Dunn actually found with respect to their data. This little chart shows the various types of cancer here in the left column. And it takes a little time to sort of understand what these numbers mean. But for Japanese citizens living in Japan their entire lives, they have a stomach cancer rate that's 6.5 times as high as a California Caucasian person. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, this number is well below 1, which means that Japanese people have 1/10 as much a chance of getting prostate cancer as a California Caucasian. Now we get folks who have moved to California, these immigrants to California. They were born in Japan, they carry Japanese genes, but now they've spent some portion of their life in California. And what Buell and Dunn found in this particular case was, whoa, the stomach cancer rate seems to have gone down, whereas the prostate cancer rate seems to have gone up. These are people with the exact same genes, but they have changed environments. So the implication here, because these numbers changed, is that environment seems to have played a role in each of these cancers. So we recognize there's probably an environmental component to it. Now we look at the offspring of those Japanese immigrants. These offspring are Japanese Americans who've lived in California their entire lives. And what we see here is another interesting phenomenon. What we see here, let's take a look at prostate cancer for a second. That prostate cancer has gone all the way up to exactly 1, which means that these Japanese offspring have exactly the same rate of cancer as Caucasian Americans, Caucasian Californians, That is suggesting probably that prostate cancer is purely environmental in this particular case. Whereas stomach cancer, the stomach cancer rate has dropped dramatically, and we recognize the environmental component to that. But this number is still 3. This number suggests that a Japanese immigrant, even if they've lived their entire lives in California, drinking Californian water, eating California food, breathing California air, they still have 3 times the rate of stomach cancer than a Caucasian Californian. So the implication there is that stomach cancer probably does at least have some genetic component. So stomach cancer, in the end of this epidemiological study, suggests that, that there are probably both environmental and genetic components, whereas prostate cancer seems to be largely environmental. So this is the power of thinking about things from an epidemiological perspective, that rather than looking at individuals, we can look at entire populations, look for patterns of diseases in those populations to better understand and take apart this idea of a balance between environment and genetics. We turn now to another technique for understanding whether or not a particular trait is genetic or environmental, and that's a group of studies called twin studies. Now, twin studies show a number of interesting advantages as an investigative technique. The first is that twins tend to share similar environments, even more so than siblings. They're going to share very similar food, very similar air, very similar life experiences, at least as close as we can get. So we can actually begin to understand what role environment is playing in the equation. A second thing is that identical twins in particular, they will share the same gene, so we can actually control for the genetic composition of individuals. And we can contrast that with fraternal twins who have differences in their genes. Typically they share about 50% of their gene pool with their twin. So we can use a comparison between identical and fraternal twins to our advantage. And the really interesting case study I'll use for talking about the use of twin studies comes from Margaret Gatz and a team of researchers from University of Southern California, published in 2006. And they looked at the role of genes and environment and their interchange with respect to understanding Alzheimer's disease. So here's the data from Margaret Gatz and her team. She is studying 2 different groups of twins. There's actually a twin database here in the United States. I don't know if there's a global one or not, where entirely voluntarily pairs of twins, either identical twins or fraternal twins, can register and record and update information about their health anonymously for the study of the genetic basis of disease. So here are monozygotic twins. These are identical twins. And in this particular study, there were 185 pairs of identical twins in the study. And dizygotic twins are our fraternal twins, and there were almost 12,000 pairs of those twins in this database that Gatz and her colleagues studied. It makes sense that we have a lot more fraternal twins. Fraternal twinning is much more common than identical twinning. And what Gatz and her colleagues discovered was that of these 185 pairs where at least one individual got Alzheimer's disease, 83 out of those 185 times, the other twin also developed Alzheimer's disease. So that gives us what's called a concordance. If one is true, what's the chances that the other is true? And that gives us a concordance of about almost 45%, that if one twin, identical, gets Alzheimer's disease, that the other one will also get it. In dizygotic twins, we see a different situation. We see actually 392, or only about 3% of the time, if one twin gets it, can we predict that the other twin will also get it. So if you compare or contrast these 2 numbers, this is suggesting that there's probably a significant genetic component to Alzheimer's disease. Monozygotic twins, twins that share the same genes, are much more likely to get Alzheimer's disease than dizygotic twins, even if they're being raised in very similar environments. Where does that leave us in the end? We recognize that we cannot do the same kind of Mendelian breeding experiments on human beings, so we need to find other investigative tools to understand whether something is more genetic or more environmental. And we've identified 3 of them over the past couple of videos. One is pedigrees. Does a condition in fact run in families? Can we observe particular patterns of dominance or recessiveness across multiple families? The second is this idea of studying conditions in larger groups, larger nationalities, larger groups of individuals who share a common gene pool, like we saw in the Japanese immigrants to California. And the third possibility is this idea of studying identical and fraternal twins to understand whether or not a gene is more common, or whether or not a characteristic is more common in identical twins as fraternal twins. So this is our library of tools for figuring out whether a particular condition is genetic or environmental.